Haidar, thanks for being with us today. We are here to talk about your new book, Banging on the Walls of the Tank, Dispatches from Gaza. Thank you for taking time. The most immediate reference point for Gaza today is the genocidal war that Israel has pursued since October 2003. However, your book offers a longer view, starting with a series of commentaries on Israel's attack on Gaza in 2009 and moving through an 18-year period of war, dispossession, and also resistance. As such, your book contextualizes the unspeakable horror that we are currently witnessing in very crucial ways. I'm thinking particularly of how, through the text that the book comprises of, you return to the phrase incremental genocide. Can you talk us through this aspect of your book and your motivations for bringing together these texts between two covers more generally?
Thank you so much, Alf. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity. But before we start, I always open by paying tribute to 38 colleagues from Aqsa University that have been killed by genocidal Israel. And I also pay tribute to more than 288 students from Aqsa University whom we've lost over the last 2 years, and more than 20 admin, in addition to all those who got injured. Now, it's important to put all of that within a context. We have, since we are doing this here on campus at UP, to remind people that in Gaza we used to have more than 11 academic institutions, including 8 universities that have been completely destroyed by apartheid Israel, including our 2 beautiful campuses, one in Gaza City itself, and the other one is in the south in Khan Yunis. And I think it's important also for people to understand that what has been going on since October 7th comes within a context, a historical and a political context at the same time. And this, I'll take this as a starting point to answer your question about, the nature of the incremental genocide that has been taking place in Gaza since 2006, actually. If you remember, in 2005, the late Prime Minister of Israel at that time, Ariel Sharon, a war criminal, decided to implement what he called a disengagement plan from Gaza City. And they claimed at the time that they wanted to withdraw all their soldiers and their illegal settlers from the Gaza Strip. And what happened, in fact, is not a withdrawal, but rather a redeployment. The same number of Israeli soldiers that were inside Gaza moved outside of Gaza and surrounded the Gaza Strip. And we were asked, after the destruction of Iraq and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that George Bush at the time wanted to spread democracy in the Middle East, and he wanted to start it by asking the people of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, that is to say, 1/3 of the Palestinian people. Because one problem that I have with the Oslo Accords, and you are familiar with the work and the critique of Oslo by the late Edward Said, is that the Oslo Accord in a way managed to reduce the Palestinian people only to those who live in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And I happen to be a resident of the Gaza Strip. Forgetting about 1.4 million third-class citizens of apartheid Israel, and forgetting about between 6 and 7 million refugees living in the diaspora, in miserable refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, you name it. So we, the residents of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, were asked to head to the polling station and vote for our representatives. And that happened in January 2006. I myself did not vote because I do not believe that you can freely vote for your representatives under the barrel of the gun of the occupier. But hey, people believed at the time, and they voted. And the surprise is that they voted against the will of the occupier. They voted against the will of the United States of America and voted against the Oslo Accords and against what I believe to be also against the two-state solution, which I strongly believe is a racist solution similar to the Bantustans of South Africa. And that was the time when apartheid Israel decided with the United States of America and in cahoot with reactionary Arab regimes and the leadership of the Palestinian people to impose a deadly hermetic siege blockade against the Gaza Strip. And that was the beginning of the incremental genocide that we are talking about. I remember I was there at the time when we tried to find milk for our children. We couldn't find milk. There was no electricity. There was no clean water. No medicines for, cancer patients, etc., etc. So, and I was not the only one who called it incremental genocide. In fact, the first intellectual, academic, activist to call it incremental genocide was none other than our friend Ilan Pappé, a courageous Israeli academic. And he was right. And I remember at the time, a piece was written by the UN Special Rapporteur to the occupied territories at the time, Richard Falk, who happened to write the foreword. I was honored actually by his foreword to this book. He wrote a piece in Counterpunch titled Prelude to Genocide. Right. So in other words, he was preparing us for what is happening right now. And we've been going through this since 2006 until apartheid Israel decided to launch its ongoing massive genocidal attack against us.
And that's, of course, what your book throws such an important light on, and it serves in that way also, of course, to me at least, as a reminder that the history of the present moment didn't start on October 7th. It happened in a context, as you've said, of incremental genocide, right?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, people tend to forget, actually, that Hamas was established in 1987. And what happened before that? In 1980, and I was there, and that, if you remember, people our age remember this very well, December 1987, that was the beginning of the first Intifada. And that's what led to the emergence of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. Whether we agree with its program or we disagree with its program, it is the product of Israel's occupation of Palestine. I also need to remind people that in 1948, with the establishment of apartheid Israel, 2/3 of the Palestinian people became refugees, including my own parents, who originally come from the ethnically cleansed and now destroyed village of Zarnuga. I myself was born in the Nusayrat refugee camp. So I am a refugee, son of 2 refugees, who used to live a very happy life before 1948 in what used to be called Palestine, and now it is Israel. Yeah. But as if that was not enough, my family and more than 280,000 people moved to the Gaza Strip, and the rest of Palestinian refugees moved to Lebanon and Syria and the West Bank, which was part of Jordan. So 280,000 people moved to the Gaza Strip, and we became refugees. 2/3 of the Palestinians of Gaza are refugees, entitled to their right of return in accordance with the United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for return of refugees and their compensation. In other words, according to international law, I am entitled to my right of return to Zarnuga. And this takes me to, if you allow me, to another point. I mean, Israel's oppression, and since we are in South Africa right now, speaking from the University of Pretoria, Now, people think that Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people is only one form of oppression, that is direct military occupation, and that's not correct. Look, I've been sitting with South African activists. I'm a dual citizen. I'm South African and Palestinian at the same time. I've been having meetings with the likes of, the anti-apartheid, fighters like chronicles, the late Desmond Tutu, who visited Gaza in 2006. I personally sat with him at the time. And all South African, anti-apartheid South African activists have told me that what you are going through in Palestine is far, far worse than what we witnessed in South Africa under apartheid. Never in the history of South Africa did the apartheid regime attack black townships with F-16, with F-15, with Merkava tanks, you name it, even with phosphorus bombs. I myself saw with my own eyes Israeli helicopters actually using phosphorus bombs against Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. So I think people need to understand this context, that Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people is multi-tiered. One form is direct military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The other form is apartheid, racial segregation. The third form is ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism, and what we are going through right now in Gaza, genocide.
So, Haidar, you've touched upon this already, but I want to talk about an aspect of this book and your work as a writer. Now, I tend to think of your work as that of a scholar, activist, and a public intellectual. But you're also writing from a viscerally personal position about Gaza, about Israel's incremental and now all-out genocide as well. So, for example, in one of the chapters in the book, you refer to your ancestral village, Sanuka, which your family was forced to leave in 1948, as you said. And in another, you write about Nusayrat, the refugee camp where you were born, and where Israel murdered 274 Palestinians in 2024, many of whom were your relatives. Can you talk to us about how the personal is political, both in this book and in your work more generally?
Yeah. Well, I've started by paying tribute to my colleagues and my friends and my students. And I also need to add that I've lost 45 cousins of mine. 45 from my father's side, from the Eid clan, and more than 20 from my mother's side. In other words, for me, the political is personal and the personal is political. I am a refugee, and as you said, I am a Palestinian academic. I spent more than 15 years in Gaza without being able to, contribute to any of the conferences that I was invited to. I was not able to leave Gaza. So people need to understand, Gaza is literally a prison. It is a concentration camp that has become an extermination camp. And I'm saying this with the conviction that Gaza, if you solve the Gaza problem, that will automatically lead to the freedom and liberation of Palestine. I'm saying this from a personal perspective, and as I said, from a political perspective. That relationship is definitely dialectical. I grew up in Gaza until I became 18 or 19 years old, and then I decided to leave and study abroad. Later on, I realized that, in fact, the Gaza Strip, as we know it right now, Alf, did not exist before 1948. There was, in 1948, when apartheid Israel decided to ethnically cleanse Palestine, pushing most Palestinians who live in the northern part of Palestine towards Lebanon and Syria, and pushing most of those who lived in the southern part toward Gaza, Israel at the time thought that Egypt would accept Palestinian refugees, but at the time, exactly like what is happening right now, by the way, because what is happening in Gaza right now is a combination of genocide and ethnic cleansing. At the time, in 1948, Egypt refused to accept Palestinian refugees. So Israel was forced in a way, you know, to construct the Gaza Strip, 360 square kilometers. Now it is the most densely populated area on earth. You have 2.4 million people living in this literally prison, literally, you know, concentration camp. So I grew up there. I grew up in Gaza. I was born in a refugee camp, and when I was 5 years old, I moved with my parents to Gaza City. And by the way, as I'm speaking to you, I'm getting messages from my nieces and friends telling me that the Israelis are asking them to leave Gaza City and move to the south. In other words, now as we are speaking, Alf, they are asking 900,000 people to move to the south. Every hour we lose a child in Gaza, and this has been happening since the beginning of the genocide, since the 7th of October 2023. And this, you know, explains to you why the personal is political. But as you said, I'm also a co-founder of PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which we launched in 2004, leading to the issuance of the first BDS call in 2005. So in a way, I am part of the non-violent movement, fighting for the freedom of Palestine, fighting for our right of return, Palestinian refugees, and fighting also for equality, equality of all residents of Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. So yes, the personal is political. I mean, you know, I've lost all those relatives of mine, all cousins, all colleagues and students. And what is expected, you know, from a person like myself as an academic? I cannot separate, you know, the classroom from what is happening outside, you know, the ivory tower that we call universities in Palestine.
Haidar, there's another theme that runs throughout your book that I'd like to talk to you about. I'm thinking about the parallels that you draw between Gaza and Palestine on the one hand and South Africa on the other hand. These parallels in your texts run between the apartheid regime in South Africa and the apartheid policies of Israel, both in relation to Gaza and Palestine and in terms of its own ethnocratic policies. But they also run between the nature of the struggle for freedom in Palestine and the struggle for freedom in South Africa. Can you talk to us about how you think about these parallels between South Africa and Palestine?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I was not the first one, and I'm not the only one who, you know, looked at those parallels between apartheid South Africa and apartheid. Now I call it genocidal Israel. Human Rights International. I'm talking about now mainstream human rights organization, international and even Israeli human rights organization. So you have a report by Human Rights Watch. You have a report by Amnesty International calling Israel an apartheid state. You have, you know, more than one report by UN organizations, including ISQA. And then you have B'Tselem report calling Israel an apartheid state, and that was before the beginning of the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
And it's important to note here, right, that B'Tselem is an Israeli organization.
It's mainstream Israeli organizations, and lately you have Israeli Physicians for Human Rights calling what is happening right now in Gaza genocide. So I think it's an sort of established scholarship that what is happening, the kind of oppression that the Palestinians inside Palestine are being exposed to, is a form of apartheid. But as I said in my answer to your previous questions, apartheid is only one form of oppression that is being exercised by apartheid Israel against its own Palestinian citizens. And, you know, I call them third and even fourth class citizens of apartheid Israel. I also need to take you back to the 2018 Knesset. Knesset is the Israeli parliament. Basic law, the nation state law that defines Israel as the state of Jews only. That the language of Israel is only Hebrew, and that only Jewish people in Palestine and even in the diaspora have the right to self-determination. So where does that leave non-Jews in Palestine? Where does that leave us Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, Palestinians living in Israel as third and fourth class citizens, and where does that leave 6 to 7 million Palestinian refugees? And I think people tend to forget that when Israel claims that it's a liberal democracy, and I have a very serious problem with that, that it is not different from the liberal democracy of apartheid, democracy for whites only. So what you have in Palestine is a form, in South Africa, it was a form of white supremacy, even in the American South, of course. In Palestine, it's a form of Jewish supremacy. You also need to remember that Israel is not the state of its citizens. Israel is the state of Jews only. You also need to remember that Israel is one of the very few countries in the world that does not have a constitution. Israel has basic laws, more than 60 of which define, in fact, Israel as an apartheid as an apartheid state. So in other words, you know, Israel has gone beyond the definition of apartheid. Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank is a military occupation according to United Nations, according to Security Council. What is happening right now in Gaza is not apartheid, is a genocide, or rather a combination of genocide and ethnic cleansing. But going back to the question of apartheid, we, civil society sectors in Palestine, we decided to look at the way black South Africans decided to fight against apartheid. I myself took part in the anti-racism Durban conference in 2001. And we decided to look at the South African experience. I mean, we found out that South Africa relied heavily on what they called the 4 pillars of struggle: armed struggle, political underground, mass mobilization, and boycott and international solidarity. If you remember, in the mid-80s, the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, called the ANC a terrorist, and SACP, etc., terrorist organizations. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. So I personally was involved in research. What happened between 1987? Ronald Reagan in 1987 called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. 1990, Nelson Mandela was released. 1994, South Africa became, a democracy, and Nelson Mandela became the first black president of multiracial, multi-religious, etc. South Africa. So the question we raised is, what happened between 1985 and 1990? And we had to go back, in fact, to the late 50s, when a handful of black South African fighters had a meeting in London, and they decided to call on the international community to boycott the apartheid regime, divest from apartheid and from international companies benefiting from the oppression of native South Africans, and wanted, called on the United Nations to impose sanctions against the apartheid regime. It took the international community more than 30 years to heed the call made by oppressed South Africans until the late 80s.
Yes.
And this is why we decided to issue our call, first for academic boycott of Israeli academic and cultural institutions that benefit from our oppression, leading to the global BDS call in 2005. And I tell you, without learning from South Africa, we wouldn't have been able to do that. Of course, and also learning from our own experience, the 1936, revolution in Palestine. So, in other words, South Africa, or rather lessons learned from the South African struggles, played an extremely important role in our struggle in Palestine.
I'd like to speak to you a little bit more about the BDS movement. It's a running theme throughout your book. It emerges as a particularly important strategic vector in your political imaginary, so to speak. There's a particularly evocative phrase from a text you wrote in 2017 where you refer to the BDS movement as a fight to forge an emancipatory Palestinian subject of liberation. And elsewhere you refer to the BDS movement as intending to secure the democratic rights of the Palestinian people as a whole. Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
No, absolutely. I mean, what you are raising is extremely important because there's so many people who misunderstand what the BDS call is all about. I mean, the first thing to remember, Alf, is that the BDS movement is a rights-based movement. It is not a political movement that calls for a particular political solution. When I say particular political solution, I mean two-state solution or the one-state solution. Those who fight for the two-state solution believe that the only solution is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on 22% of historic Palestine. That is to say that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem. And those who fight for the one-state solution, like myself, I believe that the only fair solution is the establishment of a secular democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, historic Palestine, a solution a la South Africa. The BDS movement does not endorse any of these solutions. And the reason is definitely tactical, because we have international law on our side. And we wanted to use international law as a weapon of struggle, as a weapon, or rather as a tool of resistance. And we had serious discussions before forming PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel in 2004. And there is a reason why we decided to form PACB before forming the Boycott National Committee, the BNC. And the reason is, to answer your question about the emancipation of the Palestinian people, is because we believe decolonizing the mind, to borrow from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, of course, decolonizing the Palestinian mind is a precondition for the decolonization of the land. And this is the reason why we decided to launch PACB in 2004, leading to the first BDS call in 2005, leading to the formation of the Boycott National Committee in the first, BDS conference in 2007. So the BNC, the Boycott National Committee, was formed in 2007, representing almost all Palestinian civil society sectors. You have, the labor unions, you have the refugees unions, you have women's unions, etc., represented on the Boycott National Committee. The second point is that BDS is a tool of struggle, is a non-violent tool of struggle in which all sectors of the society can get involved. I personally, I remember very well, I was very young at the time, in the 80s, in Europe, holding posters of Nelson Mandela, calling for the release of Nelson Mandela, making a conscious decision as an individual to boycott anything that is coming out of South Africa. And this is why now we are going through our South African moment. And that is the part that you are referring to.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that apartheid Israel is being isolated right now by the peoples of the world, from Latin America to Asia to Europe, even to the Arab world. I mean, most Arab countries do not have diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel. And let me seize this opportunity, Alf, to say that as much as we appreciate what the South African government has done by taking on apartheid Israel, by taking apartheid Israel to the ICJ, we still cannot fathom why the ANC-led government in South Africa still has diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel. You have a post-apartheid government in South Africa that fought to get rid of apartheid in South Africa, that expected the international community to have nothing to do with the apartheid regime, and at the same time having diplomatic ties with another apartheid regime, or the only remaining apartheid regime in the world. And it's not even, it's even worse than an apartheid regime, it's a genocidal regime. And at the same time, why does the South African government still allow Israeli, South African citizens to serve in the genocidal army of genocidal Israel? These are issues that we need to openly discuss, and I think it is fair, fair enough, to expect the South African government to lead, to help us lead an anti-apartheid movement against genocidal Israel. So I think the direct answer to your question is apartheid is now in the dustbin of history. And we strongly believe that apartheid in Palestine will also join the old apartheid regime in the dustbin of history.
Haidar, we're talking about objectives, strategies towards emancipation in Palestine for the Palestinian people. And I want to extend on that and talk about something very significant in your book, which is your conception, and you refer to it already, of what the strategic goal of the Palestinian struggle for freedom should be. Now, I know your work and you well enough to also know that you're a staunch critic of the Oslo Agreement, which I remember very vividly from my teenage years growing up in Norway, and the discussions that we had around that at that time. You refer to the two-state solution as entailing the Bantustanization of Palestine. You refer to it as a racist solution, and a racist solution is of course no solution to the Palestinian issue, if we should call it that. You also argue, and this is what I want to dig into, that real liberation for Palestine, for the Palestinian people, will entail de-Zionizing the state of Israel and transforming it into a state for all its citizens. These are formulations from your texts, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and all the rest of it. Now, this is of course the kind of position that's often falsely labeled as being anti-Semitic. But you argue that this goal should instead be the objective of every single person believing in liberal democracy. Talk to us about what this stance entails.
Yeah, this is a very serious question actually, Alf, and I think it will take us days to answer that, address this question. If you remember in 1994, going back to the, to the South African struggle against apartheid, when people went to the polling station and voted against apartheid, the choice was not anti-white. And nobody accused black South Africans of racism and choosing to fight against the white people. No, it was about equality. It was about, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that we are human beings, we all are equal, regardless of our race, racial identity, regardless of our gender, sexual orientation, etc., etc. That is not Israel. As I said, Israel defines itself as the state of a specific minority that claims to be a majority in Palestine. And I think one thing that people don't understand is the importance of equality in Palestine. Let me take you back to the second question you raised about, the multi-tiered form of oppression in Palestine. The occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as I said, is a direct military occupation. According to Security Council Resolution 242 and even 338, apartheid Israel is supposed to withdraw all of its troops from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Israel's presence in Gaza and the West Bank is a violation of international law. And this is why, as a BDS movement, as a BDS activist, I believe that, I told you the BDS movement is a rights-based movement. And the first thing to do is to ask apartheid Israel to withdraw from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including Eastern Jerusalem. And if it does not do that, the international community is obliged to impose sanctions against apartheid Israel. Number two, everybody knows very well that Israel is an apartheid state, that it practices apartheid against its own citizens who are non-Jews. And this comes in violation also of international law. Number three, what happened in 1948 is a process of ethnic cleansing, leading to the building of more settlements in historic Palestine and now in the West Bank, in violation of international law. Now, I'm telling you this because people tend to confuse between our belief in equality and in secular democracy in Palestine and our rights guaranteed under international law. And this is the other reason why the BDS movement decided not to endorse a political solution. What we are fighting for as BDS activists is the implementation of United Nations resolutions, including 1, withdrawal of Israeli troops from the 1967 occupied territories, 2, an end to Israel's racist laws against its own citizens of Palestinian origin, 3, an end to settler colonialism in Palestine. Now, this must lead to, or must come within a political vision. Here comes in my belief in secular democracy in Palestine, a secular democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, between Ras al-Nakura in the northern part of Palestine and Rafah in the south. Now, why is that anti-Semitic? What does the Constitution of Norway say? One of the most progressive constitutions in the world, and I studied it, is the South African Constitution, theoretically speaking. Theoretically speaking. South Africa belongs to all. You remember the Freedom Charter?
To all who live in it.
South Africa belongs to all South Africans, not to the blacks of South Africans, not to the whites, not to the Indians, no, all South Africans. In other words, all citizens of South Africa. And this is exactly what I'm calling for. Our right to self-determination, but in practical terms, what is our right to self-determination? Our right to self-determination means, to me, the most important thing is the implementation of United Nations Resolution 194, which calls for return of all Palestinian refugees and their compensations. And this is extremely important. So, and I think, this will come as a surprise to some people. I think this is a compromise. This is a huge compromise offered by the colonized indigenous population of Palestine to the settlers, to the white Ashkenazi settlers who come from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. We are offering citizenship to the settlers of Palestine. And why is that considered anti-Semitic? I fail to understand that. Anti-Semitism, accusation of anti-Semitism has been weaponized, has been used as a weapon to criticize, or rather to attack any critical voices of the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by genocidal Israel. And I think, you know, as a futuristic vision, all decent human beings, all decent people should take that into consideration. And I can tell you, all my discussions behind the scene, not before camera, behind the scenes, with politicians from Europe to Latin America to South Africa, when we tell them we're a secular democratic state in Palestine, that this is the only reasonable solution. Everybody would tell you this is the only reasonable solution. But then you have all these politicians coming, the only possible solution is a two-state solution. Okay, let's define the two-state solution, which I also call the opium of the Palestinian people. Two-state solution means that you have Israel, you know, on 78% of historic Palestine, and a demilitarized Bantustan, and I'm sure this rings a bell now, a demilitarized, well, in South Africa, they used to call them independent homelands. They were not independent.
Yep.
They were not independent at all. But anyway, on independent Palestine, on 22% of historic Palestine. How does that address the rights of 7 million Palestinian refugees who live in the diaspora? There's no answer. How does that address the rights of 1.4 million Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel who live as third-class citizens? The two-state solution does not address their right. And therefore, my understanding of our right of self-determination is freedom, justice, and equality.
Which should resonate. Those are fundamental democratic rights and aspirations, long-standing over the centuries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Haidar, we're now almost 2 years into Israel's current genocidal onslaught, which is the climax of an incremental genocide that has unfolded since the early 2000s, as we've already talked about. More than 60,000 people are confirmed dead as a result of Israel's warfare, and we know that many, many more are dead beneath the rubble. Starvation is now a primary weapon of genocide, and the Israeli army has killed more than 1,400 people while they were desperately trying to access humanitarian aid. Gaza has been destroyed and rendered uninhabitable. I know this is a difficult question, and one that is also deeply personal for you, but in this context, what does it mean to think of, to hope for, and to envision emancipation for Palestine?
Well, a real tough question. As much as I hate to talk about figures, you know, every single person who has died, who has been killed in Palestine, has a story to tell. And the reason why I decided to write this book, and the reason why I'm sitting with you right now, is because Palestinians in Gaza have been, I think, voiceless, and they need to be given a voice. As much as they are resisting. And you know, one Arabic word we use in Palestine is sumud, which means steadfastness. People in Gaza, I think, are giving the world lessons in the meaning of sumud and steadfastness. The figures you've just cited, Alf, you talked about 60,000. These are the figures given by the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And they include only registered dead people. And they are telling us that there are more than 11,000 people who have been missing. They are under al-anqad. Al-anqad means rubble. Al-anqad is the most hated word in Arabic right now in Gaza. There are two words that people hate so much in Gaza, I'm including myself. Anqad, rubble, and ashla, shredded bodies.
Yeah.
And according to a Harvard report 3 months ago, they talked about more than 377,000 people that have been killed in Gaza. According to a Lancet, the reputable medical journal, in June 2024, they talked about 186,000 people that had lost their life. That was, a year ago. And I think the figure is much, much higher. I personally believe the figure is much. I, as a person, I can cite, I can tell you names of people, not only my relatives and their kids, and I'm talking about whole families being wiped out. Families being wiped out. And when I say families, I'm not talking about your European, concept of the nuclear family. When you talk about the Eid clan, we are talking about, tens. Yeah. So as I told, I've lost 45 of my direct cousins, and from my mother's side, more than 20. So when we start talking about hope, I get phone calls almost every day, get messages almost every day on WhatsApp from friends, where are we heading? What's the end game? As I'm speaking to you right now, we've been talking for an hour now. I don't know how many kids we have lost over the last hour now in Gaza. Since the beginning of the genocide, we've been losing a child almost every hour. More than 20,000 children have been deliberately killed by apartheid Israel. Israel targets children and targets women. More than 78% of those who have been killed are women and children. More than 95% of those who have been killed are civilians. In other words, Israel deliberately targets civilians because Israel wants to first ethnically cleanse Gaza, and if it fails to do that, it wants to kill every Gazan. We are talking about 2.4 million. 77 to 80% of Gaza's buildings, houses, factories, pharmacies, schools, universities, hospitals, 90% of Gaza have been destroyed. So now, how long will it take us to reconstruct Gaza? I've been reading reports by, various organizations, some of which are talking about, it will take 5 years. Others are talking about 20 years. Others talking about 70 years to reconstruct Gaza. In the meantime, what will happen to Gazans who are living in Gaza right now? Where will they go? I myself, what is going to happen? I have 2 little kids. I haven't told them yet, them, that their school has been destroyed, that some of their friends have been killed. I cannot tell them that. Where will I go back? But I think, first of all, you cannot solve the problem without taking Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, the most fascist government in the history of the state, without taking them to The Hague. If you want justice, these people have to be behind the bars right now. And then, I'm not sure how will I be able to convince Palestinians of living with Israelis in a secular democratic state. And this is why, before talking about secular democracy and emancipation, the first thing to do is to dismantle apartheid and settler colonialism in Palestine. And I have hope. I have hope in our people. I have hope in solidarity activists and supporters, colleagues and academics, people who fight for human rights for all human beings, people who still believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are equal, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of sex, gender, sexual orientation, etc., etc. It's extremely difficult to convince Gazans this is what we are fighting for right now, because we want to right now, as I'm speaking to you, we want an end to the ongoing genocide. Now, as I'm speaking to you, I know that there are people being killed in Gaza. Yeah. The farce of aid that is taking place in Gaza. 4 aid centers. People go to get aid, you know, every single, you've cited 1,400 people, and I can tell you, much more than that, you know, have been killed there. So I think, you know, to talk about political solutions now is a luxury. What we need right now, as I'm speaking to you, Alf, is an end to this ongoing genocide, Israeli genocide of Gaza, aided and enabled by the colonial West, by the United States of America, by the European Union, and by countries who still maintain diplomatic ties with apartheid Israel.
Haidar, it's always a learning experience to speak with you. Thank you for taking the time this morning, and thank you for your steadfastness.
Thank you. Thank you so much.